common data structures that you're going to see in real life programming. The main reason is because they are uber flexible. They can basically hold any type of data you want, and oftentimes for all practical purposes, they can hold as much data as you want as well. So we're going to cover these topics today for objects. So what is an object? The definition we give here is that it's an unordered collection of key value pairs. Actually, to talk about objects, I like talking about them in the context of what they're called in other languages. So in Python, they're not called, or objects are not necessarily called objects. They're called dicts, D-I-C-T-S, short for dictionary. And so in other languages, you might also be able to say, rather than saying object, they might say, here's a dictionary, or here's a dict for short. And so if you think about why we call something a dictionary, here, when we say key value pairs, the corollary in a dictionary would be word definition pairs, right? So the way I like to think about it is, whereas an object has a bunch of keys and values associated with those keys, you can also think of it as a dictionary with a bunch of words and definitions associated with each word. It's the same exact principle in terms of kind of creating this this collection of key value pairs or word definition pairs. The unordered aspect of it is also very important, but we'll talk about that in a few slides as well. So we use, to create an object, we use a curly brace syntax, which is the same syntax that we use to create a scope. So when you read code, just make sure that you're being clear about if something's an object or something's a scope. Obviously, to create a function, that curly brace would need to be preceded by either an arrow function or the function keyword. So usually it's pretty easy, it's pretty clear kind of what's being created here. But in any case, lines 8 through 11, we create a variable called myObject, and we set it equal to this object. And the object has a bunch of key value pairs. In this case, key 1, that string key 1, is followed by a colon, which is followed by another value, which is called value 1. And notice a comma at the end of line 9. That tells us where one key value pair ends and the next key value pair starts. Okay. So in the same vein that when I have an array and I want to access the first element of the array, I just go to index 0. Here, if I want to access the first value or value 1 in the object, I basically go to my object, and I still use the same bracket notation, except instead of passing in a numerical index, I just pass in the value of the key. And so the key associated with my first value is called key 1. So I use my object index key 1, and that's going to give me value 1 for both the array and also for the object. Okay. Just to kind of make sure that we're really clear on this, that colon there on lines 9 and 10, everything to the left of the colon is considered the key. Everything to the right of the colon is considered the value. And the comma at the end of line 9, that's what separates these pairs of keys and values, or words and definitions, if you want to think of it that way. Why are objects useful? Objects are useful because they really allow us to capture kind of almost like a metadata, or basically a description or some context for what we're collecting, right? So on line 2 there, if I have a variable and I call it Pusheen, and I set it equal to an array with 3 values, Pusheen, 7, and gray and tabby. I don't actually know what Pusheen, 7, and gray and tabby mean, right? They're just, I know what values they are, but I don't know what context they are. Like, I don't know if Pusheen is a name, if it's a location, if it's a breed, or anything like that. And so that makes arrays useful in some cases, but not in every case. What an object really does is, or rather the power of an object, or sorry, one of the main benefits of the object is it actually lets you associate a key, right? So it gives you some way to identify, or ideally it gives you some way to identify what the value is. So if I was to take that Pusheen object, or that Pusheen array, and actually make it into an object, and let's say I want it to be pretty descriptive about what I'm capturing, I can actually create this Pusheen object there between lines 10 through 14. And you'll notice now, rather than just having Pusheen, 7, and gray and tabby, for each of those values, I've associated with them a key that tells me kind of what I'm looking at, right? So Pusheen is a name, 7 is the age, and gray and tabby is the color. And once again, I follow the same exact syntax as before. The colon separates the name from the value, and the commas at the end of lines 11 and 12 tells me where one key value pair ends and the next one starts. Everyone good so far? Great. One thing on, or actually, I'll go to the next slide, and then I'll talk about it. Type of object is object. This pretty much is pretty self-explanatory. We won't test on this too hard, but just remember we covered, I think it should have been for you guys the first session of Saturday, right? Type of an array is also an object. And the reason why is because even though we see array as kind of the special magical class, underneath the hood in JavaScript, it is implemented, is made just like an object. So that's something to be careful about when you do use type of for objects, is that for both arrays and objects, you are going to get objects. Okay, so creating an object. Creating an object, once again, is pretty simple. We just follow our curly braces, our curly brace syntax. One of the things here you'll notice is that, but in the previous examples, for both name, age, and color, I put quotes around it, right, to indicate to you that, hey, it's a string. Well, here in this example, you'll notice how we got rid of the quotes, but you notice how we got rid of the quotes, but the object still is created successfully. And the reason for that is on line 3 there. This is a very key point. An object's keys are always going to be strings. Okay, an object's keys will always be strings. They cannot be any other data type. They cannot be booleans, they cannot be numbers, they cannot be functions or other objects. An object's keys are always strings. Just like how if I had a dictionary, the words for the most part are always going to, assuming I'm looking at an English dictionary, the words are always going to be in English, right? They're always going to be alphabetical. Now, the values, on the other hand, can be whatever data type I want it to be, right? If you notice the example here, on line 7, I have to put quotes around Pusheen to indicate that Pusheen is a string. On line 8 there, I put 7 as a number, and obviously I have another string on line 9 there. But the point here is just to tell you that the values can be whatever data type you want it to be. Just like how if I have a dictionary and I have a word, I could very easily have a picture for a definition instead of text, right? So the values of a key value pair can be anything you want, but the key itself has to always be a string. And because that rule is very strictly enforced in JavaScript objects, when I create an object, even if I don't put quotes around the key, JavaScript will actually call a toString function on that. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to take whatever key I give it. If it's already a string, it will just use it. If it's not a string, then JavaScript will convert it to a string on my behalf. Okay, and so that's why here on line 7, 8, and 9, even though I don't have quotes around name, age, and color, just know that those are still strings, and JavaScript is going to very strictly enforce that. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool. Oh, sorry, there a question?
Yes. If you're using, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Okay. If you said that we can omit the what's it called?
Quotation marks?
Yes, quotation mark.
Mhm.
When we are calling it, do we have to? If we don't use it, then will it still work?
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we talk about accessing. You're basically saying like once I've created it.
Yeah,
We'll talk about that in the next slide and the slide after that too. So
okay.
hold tight, and then if your question still persists, just let me know at the end of those 2 slides.
All right.
Cool. So this is just a basis of creating an object. And now if I want to access a value, we go back to our old friends, the bracket notation, right? And so here on line 11, I think to answer your question, here if I want to access the value associated with name, I need to put name in parentheses or in quotation marks. And the reason why, so a few things, right? So here, if I want to access the values associated with name, age, and color, I need to access that way. I need to say object bracket notation, and I need to give the key's name as a string. And then just like how if I try to access an element in an array that doesn't exist, I don't get back an error per se. I get back an undefined. the same exact thing applies to an object, where if I try to access a key that does not exist, it won't give me back an error, it will just give me back undefined, which means this could possibly exist, but it doesn't exist yet, right? And if you remember, the reason why this happens is because I am always able to change an object or change an array, right? So JavaScript would never say, hey, this definitively does not exist. It will say, hey, this might exist sometime later, but not yet. At least as of this point in time, it doesn't quite exist. Okay. So here you notice, I guess, Satashi's question, right? We are using the key name with the quotes around it to kind of be very explicit that it is a string. And the reason why we do that is because we need to make sure that when JavaScript reads that, it knows that the name that variable that key name is a string and not a variable, right? So here on line 10, we actually create a variable called key to check, and we set it equal to the string name. And on line 12, in order to access the value associated with name, I actually do pushing bracket notation and the variable key to check. Okay, and so this is why when we're creating an object, when we make the keys, the quotation marks isn't very important because JavaScript says, hey, that key has to be a string no matter what. But when we use bracket notation to access an object, that quotation marks matter a lot because the JavaScript can determine if key to check or if whatever in between your brackets, if that's a variable or a string. So if you don't have quotes around it, it's going to assume it's a variable. If you have quotes around it, it's going to assume it's a string, right? And even within the bracket notation, you can always use operations too. So on line 13 there, I'm basically concatenating two strings, COL and OR, and that's when I join them together, that's going to give me the string color. And when I access pushing index color, the value that's associated with color there on line 7 is gray and tabby. Does this answer your question? Cool.
Yep.
Cool, right? So once again, just be really careful. When you create an object, that's the only time in which you can be loose. Although if you want to just be very strict with yourself, you could always just write quotes around the string, the key. Around the key string. So on lines 5, 6, and 7, if you put quotes around name, age, and color, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, and JavaScript will let you do that, or do what you currently see here, which is write it without the quotes. Okay. There's this other way to access values in an object using something called the dot notation. I'm not as big of a fan of dot notation. I'll tell you why. Dot notation is supposed to be kind of a simpler way to access object values. Rather than doing pushing bracket quotation mark name, you can just do pushing dot name with no quotation marks, and that's also going to give you the value associated with name. Now, if I do it for name, age, and color, that all works perfectly fine. But the reason why I don't really like it as much, especially when you're first starting off using objects, is on line 14. If you notice, if I do pushing dot key to check, well, whenever I use dot notation, the assumption that I'm making with JavaScript is, hey, can you look up this key for me? And the key will be called exactly this, right? So when I do pushing that name there on line 11, I'm saying the name is called key, right? It's going to be name as a string key. And so when I use dot notation, whatever comes after the dot is inherently going to be treated as a string. On line 14 there, if I do pushing dot key to check, conceptually, I know what you want me to do is say, hey, look on line 9, key to check is equal to the string name, so let's do pushing that name. But in reality, JavaScript's going to follow the same rules because it's not smart enough to know what you mean. And so when you do pushing dot key to check on line 14 there, it's actually going to treat key to check not as a variable, but as a string, just like it does name, age, and color on lines 11 through 13. And so what line 14 is going to do is that it's going to make JavaScript go to the pushing object and look for a key called literally key to check. And it's not going to find it because it doesn't exist. And so therefore, that's why you get undefined there as a fourth printout. Everyone still with you so far? So this is one of the limitations of using dot notation. It looks simpler, it looks cleaner, but one of the major limitations of dot notation is that you are not able to use variables with dot notation. You have to know exactly what the string, or sorry, what the key is called. Whereas before, if I go back to the previous slide here, if I use bracket notation, I can put either a string in the bracket or a variable, right? So I have a lot more flexibility with what I use. Okay, so that's accessing values. And then the last kind of two straightforward operations we'll do, adding a key value pair. It's literally as simple as doing pushing and then using either bracket or dot notation to indicate the key that you want to be creating, and we set it equal to the value, right? And in this case, and in most cases, or sorry, and in JavaScript, if I try to do this with a key that already exists, then that's basically the same as changing a value. So here, if I do on line 3, on line 5 there, if I create an object called pushing, I have an age equals 7. On line 9, if I access that, once again, if I access that key, age, whether using bracket notation or with dot notation, it doesn't matter to me. But whenever I assign it a new value, all that does is basically it replaces the previous value, because once again, just like how in a dictionary, you really can't have the same word appear multiple times. In a JavaScript object, each key can only exist once, right? So if I have a key called x, that can only ever hold one value. If I ever want to use object.x for something else, well, that x is going to replace my old x. Or sorry, the value for that x is going to replace the value for my old x. Right? So changing and adding a value is literally identical in terms of just using the same equal sign as the assignment operator. Or doing what you see there on line 10 and just doing plus plus, which is just shorthand for an assignment operator. Cool. And then deleting a key value pair, it makes use of this delete keyword, this reserved word. This one I wouldn't stress too much about. When you delete a key value pair, that means you both delete the key and the value. In the vast majority of cases, you will never use this. And the reason why is because if you think about like a dictionary, like if there's a word in there you don't use, you don't like remove it from your dictionary, right? You just kind of leave it there and never look at it. And so that's by far the most common way people deal with objects, is saying, hey, if I have a key value pair that I don't use, so what, right? I'll just leave it in there. Memory's cheap nowadays. It's not a big deal. The only time in which this really kind of comes, this will actually be, used in a practical sense is for security reasons. If you have something in the object that you don't want whoever you're giving the object to see. So for example, you might have an object of someone, right, that has their email, username, and password. But before you hand off an object to someone else, you might say, hey, I don't want them to see this person's email or password, right? So you could delete the key value pairs associated with email and password, or email and password, and then just pass on the object with username. So that's, in my mind, the most clear example when you want to delete a key value pair. Otherwise, you will very rarely have to use the delete keyword. Okay, cool. So that was pretty fast, but also hopefully no one was incredibly lost. A lot of that was review, and it functions a lot like an object, quite honestly, or sorry, quite like an array in a lot of ways. Right? We see the same bracket notation, we see the same assignment operators, etc. So now we're going to talk about some things that are new-ish, that's unique mostly to objects. The first one is called the in operator, and the in operator is pretty straightforward. It just checks to see if a given key is going to be in the object. So the way I use it is literally just like what I see on line 9 there. If I have the string name and I put in and then the object, that's going to return to me a Boolean. It's just going to tell me, hey, does the pushing object have a key name, right? On line 10 is, does the pushing object have a key status? And so it's very, very, so it's very, very straightforward in terms of just giving me back a Boolean, yes or no, does this key exist? Okay, this one I think most people can grasp pretty intuitively. Where it gets harder is when we combine it with our for loop, and we create this new tool at our disposal called the for in loop. Okay, if I think about an array, so let's take a step back and think about an array, right? If I was to say, hey, I want to do something to every single element in the array, whether it be to modify it or just to look at it or know what the value is or to print it out, I usually start, and say, hey, I know how long this array is, right? This array has a dot length property, and I'm just going to go through every index in the array from 0 all the way up to the actual length of the array, and I can do something to it. With an object, it's a little bit trickier because objects don't really have what we call length. And if you remember if you remember from the very first slide, we also made a note to say that objects are unordered, which means that it's not like any key value pair, quote unquote, comes before the other one. In fact, if order really matters to you, if there is like a precedence, like this value should come before this value, then you shouldn't be using objects. You should be using an array. By definition, when people use arrays, or sorry, people use objects, the assumption there is that I have this pile of data, but none of them should come, quote unquote, before any other data value. Okay, so with an array, I can, if I want to do something to every element in the array, I can loop through it based on the index and the length of the array. With an object, there's less things for me to do that by, and so one of the tools that JavaScript gives to you is this for and loop. And so what the for and loop basically does is it actually allows you to iterate through every single key in an object. So if I have this Pusheen object again, on line 9 there, if I do for let key in Pusheen, that's basically what that's going to do is that's going to automatically, on my behalf, go through every single key value pair in Pusheen, and it's going to say, hey, the key is this. And on the next run, it'll say another key is this. And on the following run, it'll say another key is this. And I'll just keep doing that over and over and over again until I've pretty much covered every single key value pair in the function. Sorry, in the object. Okay, and so this is something that I know, during the workshop you might struggle with, and it's just something that I really encourage you to kind of keep in the back of mind right now. If I have an object called Pusheen and I have the key for that object, the way to access the value associated with that key is to do what we see at the end of line 10 here, right? So I do the object. I use, in this case, I have to use bracket notation because key is a variable, right? It's not an explicit string value. And so now by doing Pusheen bracket notation key, that's going to give me access to the value associated with the key in Pusheen. Okay, and so when we use the for and loop, what the for and loop allows us to do is it basically say, I am going to, on your behalf, go through every single key in this object. And once you have the key and the object, you are also able to get access to the value of the object yourself by doing what we see there at the end of line 10, right? Of using traditional bracket notation. Just note that for and loop will go through every single key value pair in your object, so you don't need to worry that something's going to be left out. By definition, it will go through every single key value pair. Order does not matter, and it should not matter because you're using an object. And the last thing is, obviously, because it goes through every single key value pair, if you say, hey, what if I only wanted to go through the first 10 key value pairs? Well, that's not possible because in object terms, at least, there is no quote-unquote first 10 key value pairs. So use for and loop if you want to access everything in the object. If you don't want to access everything in the object, don't use a for and loop, right? There's other ways for you to kind of directly access the keys and values in the array, such as bracket notation or dot notation. So that's just a for and loop. And now notice how that console log on line 10, it runs 3 times. Because on line 9, when I do my for and loop, that's going to run the key value for let key in Pusheen. That's going to run that loop 3 times, and each time the key variable is going to be a different string value, and that string value is going to be one of the keys in Pusheen. And so in this case, because it went in order, we can say on the console log on line 10, it ran 3 times. The first time it says name is Pusheen, second time it says age is 7, and then lastly, the third time the color is gray and tabby. Does this make sense, folks?
So I don't know if you explicitly said you can't do this, but I understand the unordered aspect to an object, but can you call dot length on one?
No, object.length does not exist.
So okay, I I guess I'm not looking for like why JavaScript creators said let's not do that, but an object does have a length, right? Like, would you agree with that? I guess.
It has a number of key value pairs. The problem, so the reason why JavaScript is resistant to calling a length is because if I say something is 4 units long, then that also implies that there is a first unit, a second unit, and a third unit, which also implies that there's an order. And objects wants to kind of be very clear that there's no quote unquote order, right? So if I say I can say there are 4 key value. So in the next slide, we'll talk about kind of one way to transform an object into an array. But like in this organic form, the object is a collection of data. You can tell me how many things there are in here, but it's traditionally speaking, you don't, because when you use dot length implies not just a length, but some sort of order. And JavaScript objects don't have order. So if I was to, so if I want to go, this is just another example of the same thing. This slide the only difference between this slide and the previous slide is on line 10 there. We show you the dangers of using dot notation when you meant to use bracket notation, right? So if I just do pushing dot key, well, that's going to mess up all of my code because dot key basically says, hey, look for a key called literally key. And because that doesn't exist, when I print it out, I get back undefined there that you see on the top right hand corner of my screen. So once again, if you're using a for loop, you should almost always be using bracket notation instead of dot notation. And then I think this might help answer your question a little bit more, Andy, which is to say that if I want to just look at all the keys in an object and do object.keys, and I pass in obviously the object, that's going to give me back an array with all the keys. And so an array has a dot length property. So this probably pretty much helps you get to the idea of, if you don't know how many keys there are, I can give you that in an array. If you don't know how many values there are, object.values is also a valid function that gives you all the values in an array. And so both of those arrays have dot length. But it's, yeah, like an object as a whole doesn't typically have a length property because one, it implies some sort of order, and then two is a key value pair it's not. I know how as humans we can see it as one thing, but in JavaScript land it's not technically, I think, one thing. Like it's two different things that are just correlated. Because one's a string and one's like a value, and you can have the value be whatever you want it to be. And so because of that, it's a little bit it's a little bit like tricky to think about, but just objects don't have length, I guess is the short of it in JavaScript. And then this is the last slide here. In the same way that when we talk about arrays, we can say, hey, we can have arrays inside of arrays. Well, the same concept applies to objects. We can have objects as values of other objects. Remember, the key of an object has to always be a string, but the value of that key can be whatever you want it to be, right? And so there on line 4, we see we have the Pusheen object, has a name, key value pair, an age, key value pair, but on line 7 there, it has a siblings key, and the value for siblings is actually another object. And that object has its own key value pairs of sister and brother. And looking at line 13 there, when I do Pusheen.siblings.sister, that makes a few assumptions, right? One is Pusheen.siblings implies that there is a key called siblings, right? Spelled that exact way. Because I'm basically implying siblings is a string when I use dot notation. It's implying there's a siblings key in Pusheen, and Pusheen.siblings is going to give me the value associated with that key. In this case, a value associated with Pusheen.siblings on line 7 is in another object. And then when I do that object.sister, that means I'm looking for the quote-unquote string sister key in the siblings object. And I see that on line 8 that key exists and the value associated with it is Stormy. And then similarly for brother, we have Pip. And so when I print it out, that prints out too. And so in the same way that we're able to chain together multiple functions in an array, we are also able to chain together multiple things in an object. And for lines 13 and 14, we happen to use dot notation there. If we use bracket notation, it would work the same exact way. We just need to be careful that we need to put siblings and sister and brother in quotation marks to denote that it's a string and not a variable. And that is pretty much it in our section on objects. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about objects and object functions, and we'll go a little bit more in depth. But today is just kind of the high-level overview of intro of, hey, this is an object. So if it seems simple, that's by design. It's meant to kind of incorporate a lot of fundamentals of objects. But at the very end there, we gave you some tools you probably haven't seen before, like the for and loop. And so that's going to be a lot of the crux of your workshop problem tonight, is not just knowing how to create and read an object, but how to traverse or go through one in the same way that you've been working on traversing through arrays. So at this point, I'm going to stop and pause for any questions folks may have.
My burning question is,
Go ahead.
is Pusheen a real kitty?
I do not know. This was made a long time ago, so it might be a full-grown cat by now if it was ever real.
Okay.
It's a meme reference.
Yeah, the Pop-Tart cat, right? Oh no, sorry, that's Nyan Cat. I actually don't know what push.
That was Nyan Cat.
Yeah.
Was like
It's a gray thing, right?
oh, yeah, it's the gray one.
That's Pusheen right there. In case anyone's interested. Cool. Any questions on objects? All right. Well, if not, then I am gonna get you broken up into your workshop groups.